There are places where people believe nothing truly terrible can happen, small towns where the loudest noise is usually a lawnmower, and the biggest trouble is a lost dog. The Northwood community was one of those places. A neighborhood built on familiar routines, friendly greetings, and the comforting illusion that violence belonged to some distant world seen only on television. But illusions have a cruel habit of shattering without warning, and when they do, they leave behind a silence that feels unnatural, almost haunted. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, long shadows stretched across manicured lawns, while the autumn breeze brushed gently against quiet homes. Nothing seemed out of place, until one mother realized her son should have walked through the door hours ago. Christopher Green was the kind of boy who treated responsibility like a promise written in stone. He was always home on time, always where he said he'd be. So when the clock ticked past 5, worry began to coil inside his mother's chest with a sharpness she couldn't explain, but every parent would recognize instantly. She called his name once, then twice, then a third time, each echo thinning into a dreadful silence that swallowed every corner of their home. Christopher was not reckless, not unpredictable. He was dependable, gentle, the type of teenager who found comfort in order and kindness. And that made this sudden disappearance feel more like a rupture than a delay, a tear in the very fabric of their predictable world. As police cars rolled into the neighborhood and officers began knocking on doors, neighbors felt something tightening in the air, an unease they couldn't describe but couldn't ignore. It was the moment a community took its first step into a nightmare it never imagined could belong to them. But what none of them knew was that this wasn't simply a case of a missing boy. It was the beginning of a story shaped by arrogance, cruelty, and a mind that believed itself untouchable. Because somewhere nearby, the person responsible was watching, and he wasn't afraid at all. Christopher Green lived a life built on gentle routines, the kind that create a quiet sense of safety in any home. He wasn't the loudest kid in school, nor the one chasing attention. Instead, he was the kind of teenager who found comfort in small, thoughtful habits, helping classmates with homework, organizing shelves at the local library, and promising his mother he'd be home by the same time every day. These patterns weren't just routines, they were anchors that kept his family grounded. So when one of those anchors suddenly slipped, the entire structure of their world began to tilt. Inside the Green home, the atmosphere shifted from mild concern to full-fledged dread. His mother reheated the dinner she had prepared, telling herself he'd walk in any moment with one of his polite apologies. But the minutes stretched, then doubled, then became hours. Each passing moment made the silence feel heavier. She checked his room, untouched, called his phone, no answer, asked neighbors, no one had seen him. The uneasiness grew sharp enough to hurt. Christopher wasn't the kind of boy who vanished without reason. His life was a collection of simple joys, building model rockets, reading classic science fiction, and saving stray animals whenever he could. He was a gentle soul in a world that didn't always reward gentleness, and every person around him knew it, which made his disappearance feel not just wrong, but impossible. When the call to the police finally came, her voice trembled, not because she feared trouble, but because she feared truth. Mothers have instincts that go beyond logic, and in that moment, deep inside her heart, she knew something terrible had already happened. Officers responded quickly, spreading through the neighborhood, asking questions, retracing Christopher's steps. The searchlights flickered against the darkening sky as neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering to one another. There was no chaos, no screaming, just a quiet tension, like the air was holding its breath. What no one realized yet was that Christopher hadn't stumbled into danger by accident. He had crossed paths with someone who saw kindness as weakness and weakness as something that needed to be erased. And the first clue to that truth was waiting less than a mile away, under the shadow of an old oak tree. The search for Christopher intensified as daylight thinned into the soft glow of early evening. Police officers formed grids, neighbors stepped out with flashlights, and Christopher's name echoed through the quiet streets with growing desperation. But even in the midst of all that activity, there was a chilling stillness, something in the air that felt wrong, as if the world itself was bracing for the blow it knew was coming. Less than a mile from the Green home, tucked between two calm cul-de-sacs, lay a small park that had always been a sanctuary for families. Children had played beneath its sprawling oaks for years, their laughter drifting across the grass like a familiar melody. But on this night, the park held a silence so heavy it pressed against the lungs of the officers moving through it. Flashlights swept across the ground, illuminating fallen leaves, empty benches, and the worn path kids used to race their bicycles. It all looked normal until it didn't. Beside the oldest oak tree, its roots thick and twisted like the veins of some ancient creature, an officer froze. His beam of light stopped on something that did not belong in a peaceful place. A shoe small, clean, unmistakably Christopher's. He called out for backup, his voice tighter than he intended. Within seconds, the area was flooded with officers, their faces hardening as they followed a trail that led behind the tree. There, lying still beneath the weight of a world he never deserved, was Christopher Green. The brutality of what had been done to him defied belief. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of panic or anger. It was an act carried out with intention, cruel, cold, and deeply personal in its execution. The contrast between the serene park and the violence inflicted upon him was grotesque, a violation of everything that place represented. When news reached the Green family, their world didn't just break, it disintegrated. A kind, gentle boy who spent his life spreading small bits of goodness had been taken in the ugliest way imaginable. And the person who did it wasn't a stranger hiding in the shadows of the community. He was someone Christopher saw every day. Because just beyond the grief and shock, detectives had already begun noticing a strange pattern, one that pointed to a teenager who didn't run, didn't hide, and wasn't afraid at all. In the hours after Christopher's body was found, the tone of the investigation shifted from hopeful search to grim determination. Detectives now faced a new mission, not to find a missing boy, but to uncover the mind behind a killing that felt disturbingly deliberate. The brutality wasn't random, and it didn't resemble the reckless violence of a panicked teenager. It carried intention, almost as if the person responsible believed this act proved something. Detectives Joseph Clark and Mark Allen began their work the way experienced investigators always do, by reconstructing the victim's final hours. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, students, and anyone who had crossed paths with Christopher that day. The picture they built was heartbreakingly consistent. Christopher wasn't the kind of boy who made enemies. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't threaten anyone. He helped with homework, volunteered at the animal shelter, and was known for holding doors for teachers carrying books. A quiet, gentle presence in the noisy world of high school, but one name kept appearing, almost quietly, almost reluctantly, from the students they questioned: Malik Robinson. Nobody said Malik had fought with Christopher. No one claimed they were close, but every time a student mentioned him, their voice tightened just a little, as if saying his name felt dangerous. Malik wasn't a bully in the traditional sense. He was something more unsettling, someone who watched others the way a scientist observes insects, searching for flaws, cold, detached, always glaring, always evaluating, always just a little too calm. Friends recalled seeing Christopher and Malik speaking near the school earlier that afternoon. It hadn't seemed alarming at the time, just two classmates exchanging words. But after the discovery in the park, that small, forgettable interaction took on a sinister weight. Still, detectives had no evidence, just a feeling, a faint trail leading toward a boy who didn't openly misbehave, but radiated an unsettling confidence. It wasn't enough to accuse him, but it was more than enough to look closer. Late that night, Detective Clark wrote Malik's name on a whiteboard in the investigation room. No circles, no arrows, just a name. But even that single word carried a heaviness he couldn't explain. Because the deeper detectives looked into Malik's world, the more they realized he wasn't just a suspect. He was a storm waiting to be understood. Malik Robinson was only 15, but the impression he left on people felt far older, older in a way that didn't suggest wisdom, but something cold, hardened, and disturbingly hollow. He wasn't popular or well-liked, yet he carried himself as though everyone around him existed in a lower orbit, irrelevant unless they served a purpose. Teachers described him as intelligent but uncooperative. Students described him as quiet but unnervingly aware. And detectives, after just a few interviews, began to sense something far more troubling. Malik didn't see other people as people at all. When investigators looked into his school records, they noticed a pattern. Malik did well academically when he cared to, but his grades weren't the issue. His behavior was. He challenged teachers not out of curiosity, but out of superiority, questioning their expertise, mocking their explanations, correcting them in ways that seemed designed to embarrass them rather than learn from them. Classmates avoided him, not because he caused trouble, but because being near him felt like standing too close to something unpredictable and sharp. He didn't fight, he didn't shout, he didn't get detention. Instead, he lived in a kind of psychological distance, a boy who walked the halls like an observer, not a participant, someone who noticed every weakness, every insecurity, every vulnerability in others, and tucked those observations away like tools in a box he might one day decide to use. This detachment wasn't outwardly violent, but it was chilling. His emotional responses didn't match normal teenage behavior. When others cried, he stared. When others laughed, he looked confused. When others felt empathy, Malik seemed to feel nothing at all. Detectives also discovered that Malik had no true friends, only temporary acquaintances who quickly drifted away. Not because Malik pushed them out, but because interacting with him felt like being studied under a microscope. He analyzed people. He probed for reactions. He watched them the way a predator calculates distance. And while most teenagers spent their time thinking about friends, grades, or hobbies, Malik spent his nights living inside a world of his own construction, one where he was judge, jury, and executioner of the social order he believed everyone else failed to uphold. But detectives had no idea how deep that hidden world went, or how much darkness Malik had already been feeding long before Christopher crossed his path. The deeper detectives dug into Malik's history, the clearer one thing became. This was not a boy shaped by circumstance. This was a boy shaped by contempt. Malik seemed to walk through life believing everyone else was beneath him. Not out of insecurity or trauma, but from a cold certainty that he was superior. Students he interacted with described a strange pattern. He didn't bully physically, he bullied psychologically. A quiet remark about someone's intelligence, a cutting observation about someone's weakness, a smirk when someone stumbled or struggled. It wasn't overt cruelty, it was precise, calculated, and intentional. Teachers noticed it too. Malik would listen to lessons with a blank face, then interrupt to correct minor details, not because he cared, but because he enjoyed watching an adult stumble for words. One teacher even described feeling challenged by him, as if Malik were waiting for her to slip, just so he could expose her mistake with a cold, satisfied stare. That wasn't normal teenage behavior. That was predatory curiosity dressed in the body of a 15-year-old. And while his classmates bonded over sports, video games, or shared struggles, Malik didn't bond with anyone. He observed them like moving pieces on a board, pieces he believed he could manipulate if he chose. He had no close friends, no confidants, no meaningful connections. What he did have was a quiet resentment toward everyone who didn't operate by his standards, which included almost everyone. His worldview was built on a twisted logic. Strength deserves to rule, weakness deserves to be punished. To most people, this was an alarming thought. To Malik, it was simple truth. He hid this belief beneath a facade of silence, but his journals, later discovered, revealed he'd been cultivating this ideology for years. Detectives couldn't find a single instance where Malik showed kindness, sympathy, or basic human empathy. If anything, he was fascinated by suffering, curious about it, drawn to it, but never moved by it. This wasn't just arrogance. It was emotional emptiness, the kind that often precedes something far more dangerous. And detectives were about to discover that Malik's contempt wasn't just a mindset. It was already shaping the choices he made on the day Christopher died. 2 days after Christopher's body was discovered, detectives Clark and Allen decided it was time to speak with Malik Robinson directly. They didn't have enough evidence to accuse him of anything, but his name had surfaced just enough times to make him impossible to ignore. When they arrived at the Robinson home, they expected a nervous teenager, a frightened kid shaken by tragedy. Instead, they found Malik sitting calmly on the porch, scrolling through his phone without a trace of tension, almost as if he'd been expecting them. He didn't flinch when the detectives introduced themselves. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't even show confusion or fear. He looked up with a mild curiosity, the kind you'd expect from someone watching a slow TV commercial, not someone being questioned about a classmate's murder. When informed he needed to come in for questioning, Malik didn't hesitate. He simply stood up, slipped his phone into his pocket, and followed the detectives with a faint smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. It wasn't the smirk of a child caught misbehaving. It was the smirk of someone who believed he understood more than the adults around him. At the station, Malik was placed in a windowless interrogation room, but the confined space seemed to have no effect on him. He examined the table, the mirror, the walls, like he was studying the environment rather than experiencing it. When asked if he wanted a lawyer, he waved the offer away. "I don't need one," he said, his tone almost bored. Detective Clark tried the usual rapport-building techniques, asking about school, life, friends. Malik answered with clipped, dismissive responses, as if each question was beneath him. When asked about Christopher Green, he didn't express sadness or shock. Instead, he spoke of him vaguely, calling him soft, predictable, and one of those kids who didn't get how things worked. His tone wasn't angry, it was condescending. But the most chilling moment came when a photo of Christopher was placed on the table. Malik didn't look mournful or uneasy. Instead, after a brief stare, he let out a sharp, mocking laugh, a sound so cold it made both detectives shift in their seats. And that laugh was only the beginning, because Malik was seconds away from revealing far more than any guilty person should. Detective Allen placed a single photograph on the table, a picture of Christopher Green taken just months before his death. In the photo, Christopher was smiling softly, the kind of gentle smile that reflected exactly who he was. Interrogation rooms are designed for silence, for pressure, for emotional cracks that reveal truth. But what happened next wasn't something either detective had seen in decades of work. Malik leaned forward, not slowly, not cautiously, almost eagerly. His eyes flicked over Christopher's face with a look that wasn't grief, wasn't recognition, wasn't even discomfort. It was annoyance. He stared at the picture as if it were a waste of his time. Then, in the kind of moment that stays with detectives for the rest of their careers, Malik let out a short, sharp laugh. Not a nervous laugh, not a joke, not a misunderstanding, a laugh filled with disgust. Malik said, pushing the photo back with a single finger like it was something dirty. You're really spending taxpayer money on him. Detective Clark felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd interviewed killers, many of them. He'd listened to lies, excuses, breakdowns, but he'd never seen a 15-year-old boy look at a murdered classmate with such genuine contempt. It wasn't a denial of involvement. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was indifference to the existence of another human being. For the detectives, the moment shifted everything. Malik had not confessed, not yet, but he had revealed something more important, his mindset. His laugh wasn't just disturbing, it was revealing. It hinted at familiarity, at ownership, at a sense of superiority that only someone deeply involved in the crime would feel. As the minutes passed, the interrogation changed without anyone saying it out loud. They were no longer determining whether Malik might know something. They were evaluating how deeply he was involved. Detective Clark leaned back, studying him. Malik's smirk widened, as if he enjoyed being examined, as if he wanted to be understood by the right people. He didn't know it yet, but his arrogance had just placed him firmly at the center of the case. And in the next moments, Malik would do something no detective expected. He would start confessing, not out of guilt, but out of pride. After Malik mocked Christopher's photo, the room changed. The air tightened. The detectives exchanged a quick glance, silent, but loaded with the same realization. This boy wasn't bothered, scared, confused, or grieving. He was entertained, and that made him more dangerous than they had anticipated. Detective Clark shifted strategies. Instead of pushing harder, he pulled back, sitting quietly, letting the silence fill the room. Experienced investigators know that silence is a scalpel. It cuts, it exposes, it forces the mind to find escape. Most suspects break under silence because their guilt weighs on them. But Malik broke because silence stole his spotlight. You're asking the wrong questions, Malik said suddenly, leaning forward with a smugness that made Alan's jaw tighten. You're missing details, big ones. Clark didn't respond. He only raised an eyebrow. It was all the invitation Malik needed. He began talking, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with the arrogance of someone explaining a puzzle to children. He didn't say, I killed Christopher. He didn't need to. Instead, he dissected the investigation piece by piece. He corrected assumptions. He hinted at steps he believed the detectives had overlooked. He mocked how long it took them to bring him in. Malik wasn't confessing, he was performing. He described how weak people create chaos, how someone had to set things right, how social order needed enforcing. His words were laced with a disturbing philosophy, as if he believed his actions were justified, even necessary. Then came the moment neither detective would forget. Malik corrected a minor detail about the crime scene, something investigators had intentionally kept from the public. A detail only the killer would know. You really think the backpack was behind the tree? He scoffed. It was wedged in the hollow on the north side. If you're going to reconstruct the scene, at least get it right. Both detectives froze. He had just admitted knowledge of the scene, intimate knowledge no innocent person could have. And he said it with pride, with ownership, as if he wanted credit. Detective Allen closed his notebook slowly, realization settling in like a weight on the room. This wasn't a troubled teenager slipping under pressure. This was a predator bragging about his hunt. But the most disturbing part was still ahead, because Malik hadn't just committed the crime, he had documented it. Detectives Clark and Allen knew Malik's arrogance had just crossed a line. His casual correction about the crime scene wasn't a mistake, it was a claim, a signature. But before they could confront him, the investigation moved in a different direction. Search warrants were approved, and officers began combing through Malik's belongings. They expected to find typical teenage clutter, maybe troubling drawings, maybe notes, maybe messages. What they actually found was something far darker, something that made seasoned investigators feel physically sick. Hidden on an external hard drive, buried beneath layers of encrypted folders and misleading file names, was Malik's private world. A world he never expected adults to see. Inside were journal entries dripping with venom, long, obsessive monologues about power, weakness, and his self-proclaimed superiority. There were digital lists ranking classmates based on usefulness and inferiority. There were crude drawings depicting violence, not in artistic expression, but in strategy, like someone mapping out patterns. But the most horrifying discovery was a folder labeled Projects. Inside was a single video file. The officers who opened it could barely finish watching. The footage was shaky, taken on Malik's phone, but unmistakably deliberate. It documented Christopher's final moments, not as an accident, not as a heat-of-the-moment mistake, but as a premeditated performance. Malik didn't panic in the video. He didn't hesitate. He spoke calmly, almost narrating, as if the murder was some kind of instructional film. His voice stayed steady while Christopher begged, cried, pleaded. There was no anger, no emotion, only control. It wasn't murder in Malik's eyes. It was a masterpiece he believed he had created. The video shattered any hope that this was a crime born from teenage impulsiveness. What Malik recorded wasn't the aftermath, it was the full act. And he kept it, saved it, archived it, as if it were some kind of achievement. Detectives stared at the screen long after the video ended, unable to comprehend the coldness they had just witnessed. The digital evidence didn't just prove what Malik had done. It revealed who he truly was, not a misguided teen, but a predator who enjoyed documenting the suffering he inflicted. And as investigators dug deeper, they discovered that this recording was only the beginning of Malik's descent, because his digital archive hid even darker secrets waiting to surface. When the prosecution team first reviewed the footage found on Malik's hard drive, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself refused to move. This wasn't just evidence. It was a window into the darkest corner of a teenager's mind, a mind that had not only embraced cruelty, but recorded it with pride. In the video, Christopher's voice trembles, pleading for understanding, for a chance to walk away, for anything that might soften the situation spiraling out of his control. His words are gentle, desperate, human, but what stands out the most is not Christopher's fear, it's Malik's calmness. He speaks clearly, explaining his twisted reasoning as if giving a lecture. His breathing remains steady. There is no hesitation, no panic, no moment of remorse. The coldness is absolute. He talks to the camera as though documenting history. He talks to Christopher as though passing judgment. He talks to himself as though fulfilling a mission. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was not an accident. This was a performance. Worse yet, the video is meticulously framed. Malik adjusted angles, repositioned the camera when needed, and continued speaking even while Christopher cried. It's the behavior of someone who saw himself not as a criminal, but as an artist completing a masterpiece. And in Malik's warped perspective, Christopher was not a person. He was a prop in Malik's production. When investigators reached the final seconds of the video, none of them spoke. Even the most seasoned among them stared at the frozen image on the screen with a hollow expression. They had seen violent crimes before, but this was different. It was rare to witness the exact moment a person's humanity vanished, replaced by a chilling void where empathy should have lived. One prosecutor had to step out of the room. Another wiped tears before they could fall. Detective Clark simply closed the laptop and whispered, "This isn't a kid, this is something else." The video didn't just implicate Malik. It redefined him. But as horrific as the footage was, investigators soon discovered it wasn't the only evidence Malik had archived, and what they uncovered next revealed a pattern far more disturbing than a single act of violence. News of the video spread silently through the prosecution team, then through the police department, and eventually, inevitably, into the heart of the Northwood community. But it wasn't announced publicly. It didn't need to be. The sudden shift in the expressions of officers, teachers, and counselors told the story long before the official details reached anyone. Something had happened, something so dark it cast a shadow over an entire town that once believed it was safe. Parents who had once let their children walk to the park alone began gripping their hands a little tighter. Teachers who remembered Christopher as a polite, gentle student now walked hallways with a quiet heaviness. The school, once filled with chatter and noise, became unnervingly still. The students whispered in clusters, staring at empty seats, avoiding eye contact, and trying to make sense of the impossible. That one of their own had done something unspeakable. Rumors spread, soft at first, then louder, each version more terrifying than the last. Some said the murder was an accident. Others whispered that Malik snapped under pressure. But those who had seen Malik in school started remembering things differently. His smirk when someone stumbled, the way he stared without blinking, the strange satisfaction he seemed to get when correcting or belittling someone. One classmate admitted she always felt something off about him, like he wasn't just watching people, he was evaluating them. For the Green family, the days blurred into an unending fog of grief. Their home, once filled with Christopher's gentle energy, now felt hollow, echoing with memories too painful to revisit. Friends brought food, neighbors offered condolences, and counselors tried to help. But there are tragedies that no amount of comfort can soften. The news of how Christopher died, and that it had been filmed, spread through the family like a second blow. knocking the air out of them all over again. The community held vigils, left flowers at the school entrance, and lit candles under the old oak tree. But love, grief, and candlelight could not erase what everyone now understood. The person responsible wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He was a boy they passed in hallways, a face they recognized, someone they thought they knew. And yet, the most chilling part was still hidden, because Malik's digital archive wasn't just about Christopher. It hinted at a disturbing pattern that had been building long before the murder. As detectives pieced together Malik's digital world, prosecutors began preparing for what would become one of the most emotionally charged trials the county had ever seen. But before the jury, before the evidence, before the testimonies, there were the hearings, short procedural sessions meant to handle scheduling and legal motions. Simple, routine, predictable, except nothing about Malik Robinson was routine. From the moment he entered the courtroom for the first preliminary hearing, it became clear he intended to treat the legal system the same way he treated his peers, as a stage built for him. Wearing a bland, core-tissued sweater and escorted by officers, Malik walked with the same calm arrogance detectives had seen at his home. He didn't look frightened or confused. If anything, he looked mildly entertained. He slouched in his chair, scribbled absent-mindedly on notepads, and smirked at private jokes only he understood. While lawyers talked, while the judge spoke, while the Green family silently wept a few rows away, Malik acted like he was sitting in a boring classroom lecture. And then there was his treatment of his own defense attorney, Matthew Harris. Harris was a seasoned lawyer, respected for defending even the most difficult juvenile cases, but Malik didn't see experience, he saw weakness. Each time Harris tried to explain strategy, Malik rolled his eyes. When Harris asked him to stay quiet, Malik smirked. When Harris whispered important instructions, Malik leaned back, ignoring him entirely. During one hearing, as Harris argued a motion before the judge, Malik leaned toward him and whispered something so casually cruel that the court reporter looked up in shock. Malik had made a joke about Harris's receding hairline. A moment meant for solemnity had been twisted into entertainment. The prosecutor, Victoria Thompson, saw everything. She watched the dismissive gestures, the arrogant posture, the complete lack of fear. And in Malik's behavior, she saw a truth more powerful than any piece of evidence. This wasn't a boy holding on to innocence. This was a boy who believed he was untouchable. Every smirk, every eye roll, every whispered insult strengthened her resolve, because soon Malik's arrogance wouldn't just hurt his defense, it would expose him in front of the world, in a way even he couldn't control. Matthew Harris had defended troubled teenagers before, runaways, fighters, addicts, kids who made terrible choices in moments of panic. He knew how to navigate chaos. He knew how to calm fear. But nothing in his years of experience prepared him for the surreal challenge of representing Malik Robinson. Malik wasn't frightened, confused, remorseful, or desperate. Malik was defiant, and worse, he was proud. From the beginning, Harris tried to build the only possible narrative that could save a juvenile facing a murder charge. A story of emotional instability, impulsiveness, and a boy who needed help rather than punishment. But Malik refused to participate. He didn't want to appear remorseful. He didn't want to cooperate. He didn't even want to pretend. Every conversation became a battlefield. When Harris explained the severity of the charges, Malik smirked. When Harris urged him to stay quiet in court, Malik scoffed. When Harris tried to discuss plea deals, Malik dismissed them with a wave of his hand. What Harris needed was a scared teenager who understood the gravity of the situation. What he got was a 15-year-old who believed he was the smartest man in every room, including the courtroom. Malik corrected legal terms, criticized Harris's strategies, and once accused him of being too slow to understand the bigger picture. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court only made things worse. Malik didn't treat it as an assessment. He treated it as competition. He psychoanalyzed the doctor, questioned the methodology, mocked the conclusions before they were even written. He wasn't trying to prove innocence. He was trying to prove superiority. The irony was brutal. In a justice system built on evidence, Malik himself was becoming the prosecution's strongest weapon. His arrogance wasn't a mask hiding guilt. It was the spotlight illuminating it. Harris knew the case was slipping away, and Malik was the one kicking it off the ledge. Every smirk, every sarcastic comment, every defiant gesture added another nail to the coffin Harris was desperately trying to keep closed. But there was one moment, one courtroom exchange, where Malik's ego didn't just damage the case. It detonated it. Because soon, in a single unplanned outburst, Malik would reveal a secret detail only the killer could know, and he would do it proudly in front of everyone. The first week of trial began with a heavy silence that settled over the courtroom like a dark cloud. Reporters filled every available seat. The Green family sat in the front row, bracing themselves for what they knew would be a painful journey. Malik entered wearing a suit his lawyer had provided, an attempt to soften his image, but even wrapped in formal clothes, he radiated the same chilling indifference. Victoria Thompson, the lead prosecutor, opened with a steady, emotionally controlled statement. She didn't need drama, the facts were horrifying enough. She painted a picture of Christopher's life, his kindness, his future. Her voice tightened only once, when she described the brutality of his final moments. When it was time for Detective Clark to take the stand, the courtroom leaned forward. He recounted the investigation step by step, outlining how Christopher was found, how suspicion formed, how interviews unfolded. Malik listened with a bored expression, occasionally doodling on his notepad, his foot tapping impatiently. But then came the moment. Thompson asked Clark about the discovery of Christopher's backpack. Clark explained it was found near the old oak tree, but he intentionally left out one detail: which side of the tree. That information had never been released publicly. It was a detail only the killer would know. Before the prosecutor could continue, Malik suddenly sat up straighter. Then, loud enough for the entire jury to hear, he said, "She's wrong." Every head turned. Malik leaned forward, addressing the courtroom like a lecturer correcting a student. "The backpack wasn't behind the tree," he said with a smug half-smile. "It was stuffed inside the hollow on the north side. If you're going to tell the story, at least tell it accurately." The room froze. Jurors stared at him in shock. The judge slammed his gavel. Harris, his attorney, went pale, but the damage was already done. Malik had just publicly revealed a detail no innocent person could possibly know. Not just revealed it, boasted it. His ego had finally outpaced his ability to hide guilt. Thompson didn't need to scold him. She simply turned toward the jury, letting Malik's own words do the work. And yet, as damning as that moment was, it wasn't the evidence that would haunt the courtroom, because soon they would see exactly what Malik had recorded with his own hands. After Malik's explosive outburst, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted into something almost electric. It wasn't loud or chaotic, quite the opposite. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the room, the kind that comes when people witness something they can't unsee. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances, each one processing the same chilling truth. Malik hadn't slipped. He hadn't panicked. He had corrected the prosecution, proudly, revealing knowledge only a killer could possess. But Malik didn't understand what he'd done. He leaned back in his chair with a smug expression, as if he had just outsmarted everyone. He glanced at the jury expectantly, waiting for admiration that would never come. His attorney, Matthew Harris, stared at the table, his hands trembling slightly. He knew the case had just taken a catastrophic turn, but not for the prosecution. As witness testimonies continued that day, Malik revealed himself again and again in the smallest ways. When Christopher's teacher spoke about his kindness, Malik smirked. When a classmate trembled while answering questions, Malik rolled his eyes. When Christopher's mother wiped away tears, Malik stared at her with an expression that wasn't remorse, it was irritation. Every juror noticed. Victoria Thompson didn't need to emphasize Malik's reactions. She simply let them echo through the courtroom, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. This wasn't a scared teenager. This was someone who viewed the trial, the pain, the grief, all of it, as an inconvenience. Detective Clark watched Malik carefully from the stand. He'd seen dangerous offenders before, adults hardened by years of violence, but never a 15-year-old boy who radiated such cold hostility. Something about Malik's eyes bothered him deeply. They were flat, emotionless, and disturbingly steady, like he wasn't listening to the story of a murder he committed, but instead reviewing a performance he thought he had executed perfectly. By the end of the day, the jurors looked exhausted, emotionally drained. The prosecution had shown evidence, questioned witnesses, mapped timelines, but the most powerful evidence was sitting at the defense table, smirking, tapping his fingers, and glaring at anyone who dared look his way. They weren't watching a child-standing trial. They were watching a mask fall away, revealing something far colder underneath. And the next witness, the one no one expected, would bring a video to the courtroom that ripped away whatever illusion of humanity Malik had left. Just when the prosecution felt the case couldn't become any more alarming, a quiet shift occurred behind the scenes. A new name surfaced, someone the detectives had spoken to briefly early in the investigation, but who hadn't seemed connected. A shy girl named Riley Moore, a classmate of both Christopher and Malik. At first, she offered nothing unusual. She said she didn't know anything, didn't see anything, didn't want to get involved. She was terrified, overwhelmed, and grieving like everyone else. But as the trial unfolded, and as she watched Malik's arrogance dominate headlines, something inside her changed. A weight she had been carrying became unbearable. And just days before she was scheduled to testify, Riley broke down and confessed a secret she had been keeping from everyone, including her parents. She had been at the park that day, and she had filmed something. When Riley entered the courtroom, she looked like she might collapse under the pressure. Her hands trembled violently as she was sworn in. She avoided Malik's eyes completely. When asked to speak, her voice quivered so softly the courtroom had to lean forward to hear. Riley admitted she had been walking her dog through a wooded path near the park on the afternoon Christopher died. She noticed Malik and Christopher talking, arguing near the old oak tree. Something about Malik's posture, the intensity in his eyes, terrified her. She didn't understand what she was witnessing, but instinct told her something was wrong. So she did the one thing a frightened teenager could do. She hid behind the bushes and pressed record on her phone. The video she captured did not show the murder. She had left before things escalated, but what it did show was damning. It captured Malik circling Christopher verbally, psychologically pushing him, mocking him, lecturing him with that cold superiority. And it captured Christopher's soft, desperate attempts to calm the situation. "I don't want trouble," Christopher had said in the shaky footage. "Let's talk." The courtroom went silent as Riley's video played. The jury watched, horrified, as Malik's voice dripped with venom and dominance. It was the perfect prelude to the crime, and it proved intent. Malik watched the video with a burning anger, not because he was caught, but because someone else had dared to document his moment. But Riley's recording was only the prelude. What came next, the video Malik filmed himself, would rip the courtroom apart. Riley's shaky footage had already stunned the courtroom. It captured the tension, the intimidation, the twisted power dynamic Malik had established long before violence erupted. But the jury didn't yet know they were standing at the edge of a much darker cliff. Riley's video showed what led up to the crime. The next video, the one recovered from Malik's own hard drive, showed the crime itself. When the prosecutor announced they would now present a second video, the room grew painfully still. Even the judge shifted uncomfortably. Everyone understood what was coming. Everyone braced themselves. But nothing could truly prepare them for what they were about to witness. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered to life, and the nightmare began. Malik's camera angle was unsteady at first, then adjusted deliberately, as though he were framing a scene. His voice entered the audio before he did, calm, steady, disturbingly controlled. He was narrating, explaining his twisted reasoning, framing himself as the enforcer of some imaginary rulebook only he understood. Christopher's voice shivering, pleading cut through the audio like a knife. His fear was raw, human, heartbreaking. And beside it, Malik's cold responses sounded almost inhuman. No panic, no hesitation, no remorse. Just steady breathing and a chilling confidence, as if this wasn't a crime but an assignment. The jurors were frozen. The Green family clung to each other. A bailiff had to escort someone from the gallery who couldn't stop crying. And Malik. He watched it like he had seen it 100 times. Not in horror, not in regret, but in admiration. His eyes tracked the screen with an unsettling pride, like an artist revisiting his creation. The prosecutor didn't speak when the video ended. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was its own verdict. These two videos, Riley's prelude and Malik's recording, fit together like pieces of a monstrous puzzle. Riley had shown the moment the trap was set. Malik's video showed the moment it closed. Together, they revealed a chilling truth. This was never a sudden outburst. It was a premeditated performance of domination. Malik hadn't just taken a life. He had orchestrated it. But the courtroom hadn't seen Malik's most dangerous weapon yet, because soon he would take the witness stand himself and destroy whatever remained of his defense. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the evidence against Malik was so overwhelming that even seasoned court observers whispered that the defense might simply give up. But Malik Robinson had no intention of fading quietly into the background. He wanted the spotlight. He demanded it. And despite every warning from his attorney, he insisted on taking the witness stand. For Matthew Harris, this was the moment he'd been dreading since the trial began. Putting Malik on the stand was the legal equivalent of handing a lit match to someone standing in a pool of gasoline, but Malik would not be stopped. He believed the courtroom needed to hear his version, the version where he was the enlightened mind, the misunderstood genius, the boy who finally set the social order straight. When he took the stand, Malik smiled faintly, as though greeting an audience. He adjusted the microphone with the confidence of someone preparing to deliver a TED Talk, not defend himself against a murder charge. Even the judge watched him the way one watches a ticking clock, aware something was going to explode, unsure exactly when. Under questioning from his own attorney, Malik framed himself as a misunderstood thinker. He spoke in broad philosophical terms that made little sense, describing people as variables, society as broken, and himself as someone who saw things clearly when others couldn't. He spoke about Christopher not as a person, but as a symbol, an obstacle to what he believed was necessary. Harris tried desperately to steer him toward remorse, sympathy, anything that resembled humanity, but Malik dodged every attempt. When asked if he regretted what happened, he paused dramatically, then said, "I regret that people don't understand what I did. That's the real tragedy here." A ripple of disbelief spread through the courtroom, but the real disaster came next. When questioned about Christopher's life, Malik scoffed. When asked about the video he recorded, he claimed it was documentation for future analysis. When pushed about his intentions, he declared, "Some people have to be corrected. Someone has to show them." The words hung in the air like poison. Jurors stared at him, not with confusion but with horror. Even Malik's parents dropped their heads, unable to recognize the child speaking. Malik had not defended himself. He had exposed himself. And then came the cross-examination, where the prosecutor would dismantle Malik piece by piece and provoke a meltdown so explosive it sealed his fate forever. When Malik finished his self-glorifying testimony, the courtroom sat in stunned disbelief. He didn't sound like a frightened teenager fighting for his future. He sounded like someone lecturing a room full of people he viewed as intellectually inferior. But the real storm began when Prosecutor Victoria Thompson rose from her seat and stepped toward the witness stand. Her posture was calm, her voice steady, but every step she took carried the weight of someone who knew the truth and knew exactly how to expose it. Thompson didn't start with the murder. She started with Malik's ego. She questioned his intelligence, not by insulting him, but by referencing his school transcripts, pointing out his average grades, his behavioral issues, his incomplete assignments. Malik, who lived for the illusion of superiority, began to twitch with irritation. Then she attacked his philosophy, quoting directly from his journals. She read passages he had written with supposed brilliance, sentences that sounded grand in Malik's head but came across childish and contradictory when spoken aloud. He interrupted repeatedly, trying to correct her interpretations. Each correction made him sound more unstable, more self-obsessed, more dangerous. Next, she moved to the video. "You called this documentation," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "Tell us, Malik, when you recorded Christopher crying, was that documentation too? When he begged you to stop, were those just data points?" Malik clenched his jaw. For the first time, cracks formed in his composure. Then Thompson delivered the blow that broke him. She played a short, silent clip from the murder video, the frame where Christopher's terrified face filled the screen. Then she paused it, letting the image burn into everyone's mind. She turned back to Malik. "Is this your idea of order?" she asked quietly. "Is this the masterpiece you wanted the world to see?" Malik snapped. "You're twisting everything," he shouted, leaning forward in a rage. "He was nothing. You don't get it. He deserved it." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Jurors recoiled. The Green family sobbed. Even the judge froze in disbelief. Malik had finally shown the monstrous truth beneath his arrogance, not through evidence, not through videos, but through his own unfiltered voice. His mask wasn't slipping anymore. It was gone. But the courtroom hadn't seen the true depths of Malik's cruelty yet, because during the victim impact statements, he would commit one final act of coldness that shocked everyone to their core. With Malik's explosive outburst still echoing in the courtroom, the trial moved into one of the most emotionally devastating phases, the victim impact statements. This was the moment where Christopher Green's loved ones would speak, not about evidence or timelines, but about the boy they lost. It was the one part of the trial designed not to debate guilt, but to remind the courtroom of the human life behind the headlines. Christopher's mother, Grace Green, stepped to the podium first. Her hands shook as she held a small framed photo of her son. Her voice was fragile, trembling at first, but heartbreak has a strange strength. It breaks you open and forces truth out. She spoke about Christopher's kindness, the quiet joy he brought into their home, the plans he had for the future that would now never happen. Each word carved through the courtroom like glass. Jurors cried silently. Even the court reporter paused to wipe her eyes. And then Malik yawned. A long, slow, heavy yawn, deliberate, unapologetic, almost theatrical. He stretched his arms behind his head, glanced up at the courtroom clock, and rolled his eyes in boredom. A horrified ripple passed through the gallery. Grace Green froze mid-sentence, her expression collapsing into disbelief. The jurors stared at Malik with a mixture of disgust and fear. Even his own parents looked at him as though seeing their son for the first time and not recognizing him. It was a moment so cruel, so impossibly callous, that it left the entire courtroom stunned. Malik didn't flinch. He didn't look ashamed, he didn't even care. His body language said everything his mouth no longer needed to. Christopher meant nothing. Grief meant nothing. Human suffering meant nothing. Next, Christopher's best friend spoke, then a teacher. Finally, a letter written by Christopher's younger sister was read aloud. Simple, innocent words describing how she missed her big brother reading her stories at night. The jury wept openly. Malik stared at her words like he was analyzing a grocery list. His detachment wasn't teenage confusion. It was a void, a chilling emptiness that no therapy, no counsel, no reasoning could fill. and the jury saw it, felt it, understood it. The evidence had proven Malik guilty. But this moment, this yawn proved he was soulless. And yet the trial still had one more twist to reveal, because a surprise witness was about to expose a secret game Malik had been playing, and the horrifying reason Christopher was chosen. Just when the courtroom believed they had seen every horrifying angle of Malik Robinson's cruelty, the prosecution revealed a final witness, one no one expected, not even Malik's own attorney. A young man named Andrew Thomas stepped forward. He had moved away years earlier and hadn't been on anyone's radar. But after seeing the trial coverage, he contacted police with information so disturbing it reframed the entire case. Andrew walked to the stand with visible tension in his shoulders. His voice cracked as he introduced himself. He and Malik had once been friends, not because Andrew liked him, but because Malik had a way of pulling people into his orbit. What Andrew described next silenced the courtroom in a way even the murder video hadn't. Malik had created a secret game, not a video game, not a playground challenge. A psychological game built entirely on cruelty, domination, and manipulation. He called it the God Game. The rules were simple but twisted. Participants, mostly boys who looked up to Malik or feared him, would earn points for acts of humiliation, intimidation, and calculated cruelty against classmates they viewed as weak. Malik wasn't just a participant. He was the creator, the game master, the one who set the rules and constantly pushed everyone to be stronger by being more heartless. Andrew described how he initially joined thinking it was some edgy school joke, until Malik pushed the group into darker actions. The game escalated from mocking people to sabotaging belongings, then to physical intimidation. Andrew grew uncomfortable. Malik didn't. Malik thrived. But the most terrifying part was what Malik told them during one of their meetings. He claimed the game's final level was something no one else could reach, something only he was strong enough to do. The final level required removing someone from the system entirely. It required taking a life. Andrew's voice trembled as he recalled Malik saying, "Only a god decides who gets erased." Christopher, with his kindness and gentle nature, wasn't targeted because he did something wrong. He was targeted because he represented everything Malik despised: softness, empathy, goodness. In Malik's twisted logic, Christopher was the perfect pawn. When Andrew finished testifying, Malik finally reacted, not with fear but with rage. His face contorted and he glared at Andrew like a deity betrayed by a follower. For the jury, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Christopher hadn't been killed in a moment of anger. He had been selected as part of a sick, delusional game. And now, with everything exposed, the judge would deliver one of the most powerful, unforgettable sentences the courtroom had ever heard. By the time Andrew Thomas stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom felt drained, hollowed out by the weight of everything it had learned. Malik's actions were no longer just the cruelty of a disturbed teenager. They were the calculated steps of someone playing a self-invented game of godhood. The jurors sat pale, exhausted, and silent. Even the judge, a man known for staying composed in the worst cases, looked shaken. After a short deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that surprised no one, guilty on all counts. But the trial wasn't truly over. Not yet. In this jurisdiction, the judge had the final word, the final voice of justice, and Malik would be allowed to speak before sentencing. When given the chance to address the court, Malik stood with the same arrogance he'd shown from the start. He didn't apologize, not once. Instead, he criticized the jury, mocked the prosecution, and described the justice system as a collection of fragile minds pretending to understand strength. Then he turned toward Christopher's parents with eyes full of venom and said something so cruel the entire courtroom recoiled. "You should thank me. Before this, nobody even knew his name." Gasps spread through the gallery. Christopher's father broke down. His sister sobbed into her mother's arms. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure if someone might rush at Malik. Even Malik's own parents looked shattered, faces drained of any hope for the child they once knew. Judge Coleman had heard enough. He leaned forward, his normally calm voice replaced by a trembling storm of controlled fury. What he delivered next wasn't a typical sentencing speech. It was a moral thunderbolt. He told Malik that arrogance was not intelligence, that cruelty was not strength, that playing God did not make him powerful, it made him small. He said Malik's mind was a hollow chamber where empathy never lived, and that his actions were the very definition of evil wearing the mask of a child. He told Malik he wasn't a god, he wasn't even a man. He was a danger that society had a duty to remove. And then came the sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole, no second chances, no freedom, no stage. Malik's mask finally cracked, his hands shook. His breathing quickened, the reality of his future, an eternity in a cell, powerless, forgotten, hit him harder than any evidence ever had. But the story doesn't end here, because what happened as Malik was taken from the courtroom revealed the truth about him more clearly than anything he had ever said. As Judge Coleman's final words echoed across the courtroom, the space felt utterly still, like everyone inside was holding their breath. The sentence was clear, final, irreversible. For weeks, Malik had acted as if the world revolved around him. He believed he controlled the courtroom, the narrative, the people around him. But now, for the first time since his arrest, the illusion cracked. When the judge pronounced life without parole, Malik didn't smirk. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer some smug remark. Instead, something foreign flickered across his face, a shadow of panic, confusion, disbelief. It was as if the reality he'd convinced himself of had finally collided with the truth, and the truth didn't bow to him. As the bailiffs approached, Malik stepped back, not in anger but in fear. His fingers curled against the wooden table. His breathing grew shallow. This wasn't the confident boy who mocked teachers, police, the jury, or even a grieving mother. This was a terrified child watching his fantasy crumble into dust. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The persona he had built, cold, superior, untouchable, was slipping away like sand. Because in that moment, for the first time, Malik realized something. There was no next level, no points to win, no godhood waiting at the end of the game. There was just a cell, a small, cold, silent box where no one would fear him and no one would listen to him again. As the bailiffs took hold of his arms, Malik reacted with a sudden, desperate thrashing, anger and terror mixing into an ugly panic. His voice cracked into a high, broken scream. "You can't do this. I make the rules." I decide, but the courtroom doors didn't care about his rules. They closed behind him with a heavy finality, swallowing his cries. Inside the courtroom, Christopher's family clung to one another. Tears fell, not of victory, but of release. For the first time since the nightmare began, the air felt lighter. Not healed, but no longer suffocating. Malik had wanted to be remembered as a god. Instead, he was leaving as nothing more than a boy stripped bare, a monster with no power left to wield. Yet even after sentencing, one final, chilling detail would surface, something that proved Malik's darkness ran deeper than anyone ever imagined. In the days following the sentencing, Northwood slowly tried to return to something resembling normal life. Classrooms reopened, neighbors brought food to the Green family, reporters finally left the courthouse steps. But under the surface, something still felt deeply unsettled, like the community was waiting for one more shoe to drop. And they were right, because even after the trial, investigators continued combing through Malik's digital footprint, determined to document every piece of his twisted world. That's when they found it. Hidden deep inside one of the encrypted folders, buried within paths designed to mislead even experienced forensic teams, was a file labeled Endgame. It hadn't been shown during trial because no one had discovered it in time. But when they opened it, every officer in the room felt the same nauseating chill. The file wasn't a video. It wasn't a journal entry. It was a list. Names, ages, class schedules, vulnerabilities, fears. Dozens of students categorized with chilling precision, and beside each name was a point value, as if Malik had been assigning worth to every person he encountered. Some had small notes like easily intimidated, emotionally fragile, or follows instructions. Others had darker labels. Future target, test subject, perfect candidate. And at the very top of the list, highlighted, circled, marked with a cold finality, was Christopher Green's name. Next to it, Malik had written, "Level completion equals confirmation." It was the final proof investigators didn't even know they were missing. Christopher wasn't chosen randomly. He wasn't selected suddenly. He was hunted. Malik had planned the murder as the final achievement in his self-made game, the moment he believed would elevate him above everyone around him. It wasn't rage. It wasn't impulse. It was a long-developed ideology that had finally erupted into violence. When this file reached the prosecution's office, no charges needed revisiting. Malik was already gone forever. But the discovery gave the Green family one last piece of clarity. Their son had not died in vain. He had unknowingly stopped Malik from climbing further into whatever dark world he had been building. Christopher had been Malik's final level, but he also became the moment the monster was exposed and removed forever. But even with Malik locked away for life, the case would leave behind one haunting question the town could never fully answer. How does someone so young become capable of something so evil? In the days following the sentencing, Northwood slowly tried to return to something resembling normal life. Classrooms reopened. Neighbors brought food to the Green family. Reporters finally left the courthouse steps. But under the surface, something still felt deeply unsettled, like the community was waiting for one more shoe to drop. And they were right, because even after the trial, investigators continued combing through Malik's digital footprint, determined to document every piece of his twisted world. That's when they found it, hidden deep inside one of the encrypted folders, buried within paths designed to mislead even experienced forensic teams, was a file labeled Endgame. It hadn't been shown during trial because no one had discovered it in time. But when they opened it, every officer in the room felt the same nauseating chill. The file wasn't a video. It wasn't a journal entry. It was a list. Names, ages, class schedules, vulnerabilities, fears. Dozens of students categorized with chilling precision, and beside each name was a point value, as if Malik had been assigning worth to every person he encountered. Some had small notes like easily intimidated, emotionally fragile, or follows instructions. Others had darker labels. Future target, test subject, perfect candidate. And at the very top of the list, highlighted, circled, marked with a cold finality, was Christopher Green's name. Next to it, Malik had written, "Level completion equals confirmation." It was the final proof investigators didn't even know they were missing. Christopher wasn't chosen randomly. He wasn't selected suddenly. He was hunted. Malik had planned the murder as the final achievement in his self-made game, the moment he believed would elevate him above everyone around him. It wasn't rage. It wasn't impulse. It was a long-developed ideology that had finally erupted into violence. When this file reached the prosecution's office, no charges needed revisiting. Malik was already gone forever. But the discovery gave the Green family one last piece of clarity. Their son had not died in vain. He had unknowingly stopped Malik from climbing further into whatever dark world he had been building. Even with Malik Robinson locked behind bars, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, the community of Northwood couldn't shake the weight of one question: how does a 15-year-old become capable of such monstrous cruelty? It wasn't a question born from curiosity. It was born from fear. Not fear of Malik, he was gone, but fear of what he represented. Parents began to examine their children with new eyes, searching for signs they never thought to look for before. Teachers questioned whether they'd missed something, some red flag in Malik's behavior that could have warned them. Counselors debated whether his arrogance was always a mask for something darker, or if something had changed inside him over time. The entire town seemed caught in a collective loop, trying to understand how a child who once sat in their classrooms, ate in their cafeterias, and walked their hallways could transform into a cold, calculating predator. Experts weighed in, offering explanations that felt too clinical, too detached. Some blamed environment, some blamed personality disorders, some blamed the pressures of adolescence. But none of them offered answers that satisfied the ache inside the community's heart, because the truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. Sometimes darkness isn't created, sometimes it's uncovered. Looking back through Malik's life, investigators traced a pattern of subtle cruelty stretching years before the murder, moments dismissed as teenage arrogance, childish defiance, or harmless misbehavior. A smirk when someone was hurt. A fascination with control, a complete absence of empathy. He hadn't snapped one day. He had been evolving quietly, hiding behind good grades and a calm demeanor, building a worldview where he alone determined the value of others. The revelation shook parents deeply. Suddenly, every small behavioral shift in their children seemed suspicious. Every withdrawn moment, every harsh comment, every act of cruelty carried new weight. The community struggled with a fear they couldn't put into words. If they couldn't see the darkness growing in Malik, could they miss it in someone else? It was a fear without an answer. And as everyone wrestled with that haunting question, another disturbing truth surfaced, one that revealed Malik hadn't just acted alone in his fantasies. He had followers once, and their silence nearly helped him succeed. While the community grappled with the fear that Malik's darkness had gone unnoticed, investigators continued to dig deeper into his past. That was when a disturbing realization emerged. Malik hadn't always been operating alone. For a brief period, he had managed to pull others into his twisted orbit, shaping them, manipulating them, and quietly turning their curiosity into complicity. Andrew Thomas' testimony had revealed the existence of Malik's so-called God game, but the aftermath exposed something far more unsettling. Some students who had once been drawn to Malik weren't shocked by what he'd done. They were relieved it had ended before they got pulled in deeper. Detectives reached out to a handful of boys who had been loosely connected to Malik during middle school and early high school. Their stories were disturbingly similar. Malik had an uncanny ability to identify insecurity in others, boys who felt ignored, overshadowed, or powerless. He offered them what they desperately craved: a sense of belonging, a sense of importance, a feeling of being chosen. But there was always a cost. He demanded loyalty, obedience, silence. Some of the boys described being encouraged to do small acts of cruelty, knocking books out of someone's hands, spreading rumors, making life miserable for anyone Malik considered weak. At first, it felt like a game. But the longer they played, the more they realized Malik was serious. He kept score. He rewarded cruelty with praise and punished hesitation with scorn. One boy admitted Malik once told him, "If you can't make someone cry, you don't deserve to be here." Another recalled Malik instructing him to corner a younger kid and take his lunch money, not for profit, but for dominance. Malik would watch from a distance, evaluating the performance like a teacher grading an assignment. But as Malik grew older, his tests escalated. He became more demanding, more philosophical, more unhinged. He began talking about cleansing weakness, about removing obstacles, about playing at a higher level. That's when Andrew broke away. And slowly the others pulled back too, not because they fully understood the danger, but because Malik's intensity had become something they feared. Their silence nearly allowed him to continue unchecked. And every one of them now lived with the same guilt. If they had spoken sooner, could Christopher have been saved? But the darkest revelation was yet to come, because Malik had kept a record of these followers, and what he wrote about them revealed just how little they mattered in his twisted mind. As investigators combed further through Malik's encrypted folders, they discovered something that unsettled them even more than the endgame list. Malik hadn't only categorized potential victims, he had also documented the boys who once participated in his cruel game. The same boys who thought Malik saw them as friends, allies, or at least necessary participants, were stunned when confronted with the truth. Malik had never seen them as anything more than disposable tools. Inside a folder labeled Foundations, detectives uncovered files with names like pieces, assets, and variables. These weren't harmless notes. They were detailed breakdowns of each boy who had once followed Malik, evaluations that echoed the same cold analysis he used when selecting targets. One entry described a boy as useful for intimidation but too emotional to advance. Another was labeled eager, obedient, but weak-minded. Andrew Thomas, who had ultimately testified against Malik, was described as promising until he failed to ascend. Every boy was reduced to a summary of strengths and weaknesses, as if Malik were building a roster, not of friends, but of chess pieces. None of them were valued for their humanity. Each was graded solely on how effectively he contributed to Malik's twisted pursuit of dominance. Detectives realized something chilling. Malik never cared if they stayed or left. He only cared whether they served a purpose. If they didn't, they were discarded, emotionally, mentally, even strategically. This discovery added another gut-wrenching layer to the case. These boys weren't collaborators in Malik's ideology. They were manipulated minors who believed they were part of something rebellious, edgy, even thrilling. They didn't understand that to Malik, they were pawns, placeholders, expendable figures in a delusion he was crafting with frightening precision. And had things continued unchecked, one of them could easily have become his next target. Malik's writings hinted at it. Pieces that fail the game must be removed. For the boys who once orbited Malik, the truth was devastating. They weren't just relieved he had been caught, they were terrified of what might have happened had Christopher not been chosen first. But there was still one final chapter to unfold, a moment that tied the entire case together and gave Northwood the closure it desperately needed. With every file decrypted, every journal analyzed, and every witness interviewed, investigators felt they finally understood the scope of Malik Robinson's darkness. But there was still one final piece missing, the full closure Northwood needed. Not legal closure, the court had already handled that. This was emotional closure, something far more difficult to obtain. It came unexpectedly, on a gray afternoon when Detective Joseph Clark visited the Green family to deliver copies of the official case findings. Grace Green opened the door with tired eyes, the kind that had aged years in mere months. She invited him in quietly, Christopher's photo sitting on the living room table like a permanent reminder of the pain their home carried. As Detective Clark walked them through the final details, including Malik's endgame list, the God game, and the evaluations of his followers, Christopher's mother listened in a silence that spoke louder than grief. She didn't ask for the gruesome details. She didn't want to relive the horror. What she needed was an answer to the one question every parent asks in the darkest nights: why him? Why my son? And this time, for the first time, Clark had something resembling an answer. He explained gently that Christopher had been chosen not for anything he did wrong, but because of who he was, his kindness, his empathy, his quiet strength. Everything that made Christopher a good human being made him, in Malik's eyes, the perfect target in his delusional game. Clark expected anger, rage, a shattering collapse. Instead, Grace took a slow breath and whispered something he never forgot. He chose Christopher because my son was good, and goodness threatened him. In that moment, something shifted. Not relief, not healing, but clarity. Christopher hadn't died because he was weak. He died because Malik feared what he represented: decency, compassion, humanity. and that truth, painful as it was, allowed the Green family and the entire community to reclaim something Malik had tried to steal. The meaning of Christopher's life. He wasn't a pawn, he wasn't a score, he wasn't a level in Malik's deranged fantasy. He was a reminder that even in the presence of pure evil, goodness still matters. And now, with the truth finally laid bare, only one final chapter remained, a reflection on how Northwood would move forward from a horror it never imagined could touch its quiet streets. Northwood would never be the same, that much was certain. A quiet town that once measured time by school events and summer fairs now carried a scar that would linger for years. But scars, painful as they are, also serve another purpose. They remind us not only of what was lost, but of what survived. In the months after the trial, a slow but steady healing began. The park where Christopher's life was taken was transformed. Community members gathered to plant a garden beneath the old oak tree, not to erase what had happened, but to create a place of peace where something beautiful could grow in defiance of the darkness that once touched it. Flowers bloomed where tragedy had fallen. Benches were added so families could sit together, breathe, and remember that life continues. Christopher's school created a scholarship in his name, an award given to students who showed kindness, patience, and a willingness to help others, the very traits that defined him. Each year, a new name would be added, a new reminder that Christopher's legacy wasn't a crime scene or a headline, but a light his community refused to let fade. Parents learned to ask deeper questions. Teachers learned to listen closer. Students learned to speak up when something felt wrong. And slowly, cautiously, Northwood rebuilt the sense of safety it once took for granted, not through denial, but through awareness and unity. As for Malik Robinson, he vanished behind prison walls, no longer a looming threat but a cautionary tale. A reminder that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a quiet kid in class, unnoticed until it's too late. But Northwood refused to let his darkness define them. Instead, they chose to define themselves by the strength they found in one another. Christopher's memory became the anchor. His story, though tragic, sparked change his community desperately needed. And in that change, the people of Northwood found a way to reclaim what Malik tried to take. Because in the end, one truth echoed louder than all the horror, louder than the trial, louder than the fear. Darkness does not win when a community refuses to forget the light. Christopher's light, the boy who was good, the boy who mattered, the boy who would never be erased.